Hello Cave Dwellers. Yes, it's our old friends, the murder gloves. We haven't seen them for a while, but they've been used in force today for yet another retro micro restoration. And we are restoring machines with purpose, aren't we, Mark, at the moment? Because we've got to fill the exhibition space with computers for people to come and use and for us to film and share with you. And today is a British classic, I would say.
I would say so too.
It's the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, and in this case, it's the +2, and we're going to take you through the whole restoration process. But before we do, where does this sit in the range? Because we started with the good old dead flesh rubber keyed ZX Spectrum in, when was this, 1982? 1982?
Yep.
So how did we get from this to this? Because it is essentially the same machine, isn't it?
Yeah, so we had the 16 and 48K rubber keyed Spectrum that everybody knows, that iconic classic. Then we moved through the Spectrum Plus, which was the same machine, but in a chunkier case with a plasticky keyboard. Then we went to the 128K toast rack model, and that's very sought after, and they often go for around £200+ these days. 128K model, which then morphed into the +2 towards the end of Sinclair's tenure before it morphed into the Amstrad only models.
Yeah, I mean, the ZX Spectrum story is wide, and there's lots to talk about. Not today, but what it all comes back to is all of them are compatible with the original 48K ZX Spectrum, because that's where the user base grew from, so they've maintained that compatibility to maximize software sales.
Yeah, more or less, with a few bugs. Software will work from the earliest to the latest, but with the extensions, the ports, the printers, the joysticks, when Amstrad got their hand on the brand, they decided they'd change all the pinouts so that they could resell those valuable pieces of equipment again to the user base.
Yeah, and you can see that even within the same model. This is also a +2. It's black instead of grey. This hasn't faded. It came out of the factory this way. And you've got completely different ports on the back. So lots to talk about with the ZX Spectrum story, and we will dive into that story at one point. But right now, it's all about this +2 that we've restored.
This video is sponsored by PCBWay. You can get an instant quote on a variety of services, or browse a library of talented makers' designs, add them to your cart, and have them delivered directly to your door.
The last thing we restored was the Atari VCS, which you found in a shed that had been there for a decade.
10 years.
How does this compare? What sort of condition was this in?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag, really. So with the VCS, it just sat in a bucket, but this had been, shall we say, modified to try and extend its initial lifespan. And we've got some strange additions along the back.
Yeah, a great big screw sticking out the back. I know that's not stock. What's that all about?
It's the factory fitted, no. Well, we'll find out when we open up the machine that that's actually to stop the socket wobbling, to stop the machine cutting out.
Wow, okay, well let's go into the restoration proper, because this was quite an involved restoration for both of us, wasn't it? So we'll start with the electronics. What did you find on this side of things?
Well, when we opened up the case, the first thing that we saw was a lot of dirt. Now, usually when you open up the case of an old microcomputer, you're bound to find dust, but this was kind of grainy and wet dust. So it felt like there had been some kind of moisture inside.
You know how the further north you go, the more words you have for snow?
Yes.
I swear you must have a vocabulary of your own for all the different types of dirt that you find in these micros.
Yeah.
There's so many different ones. We need to start inventing words. We'll make a dictionary.
Filth, grunge.
Grainy filth in this one.
Grainy filth. Yeah, grainy filth, and it's really embedded on the board. So usually when you try and dust it off, it comes off, but this was really stuck on. And as we can see, looking at the keyboard, we've got quite a lot of what I would only describe as black mould spots.
Disgusting, yeah.
Yeah, so again, that's leading us to think that there's probably quite a lot of damp, or it's been stored in a damp environment. And we can see it's not really been very cared for down here either, as we're evidencing this with this chipped corner. Now that's something we probably can't do anything with, but it tells the story of the machine, and hopefully we'll be able to bring it back, make it fighting fit so that people can enjoy it in our exhibition area.
Did you try powering it up, or did you just look at it and think, I'm not even going to chance it with this one until I've serviced it?
With a plus 2, there's very little risk turning it on to test it. With the earlier 48K models, you do some resistance checks first to make sure you're not going to blow up any parts of the circuit or damage the memory. But with the plus 2 models, you're generally okay. So I did put the power supply in its socket and I wiggled it around, and for a moment, for the briefest moment, Neil, it sprang into light and stopped.
Even with that screw in the back, I'm surprised.
Even with the screw in the back. The screw had served its purpose, I think, but it was one of those, you know, hold your breath and hope it doesn't cut out. Fixes, shall we say, bodges. It's one of those things that you find sometimes in a machine where they've gone to more effort to apply a patch to a fix than just fix the original problem.
And that original problem being what, perhaps dry joints where the power socket is?
I was fully expecting to find dry solder joints on the underside because it's classic. It's an old machine. That's a part of the machine. It gets high physical traffic, so insertions. There's no power on or off switch on these models. When I looked at the underside of the machine, there was no evidence of cracking or breaking. So that led me to believe that the socket itself was probably damaged internally.
And this part here, I'm not sure this is meant to move like this, Mark.
No, it's moving, grooving, rocking and rolling, which the modulator is not meant to do. And we can see down the side that the actual 5-volt feed and the signal feed into the modulator has actually been severed by the movement. But that's not such a problem because, let's be honest, these days, who wants to tune in their Spectrum to the aerial socket? I'm actually just going to remove that entirely.
Yeah, helpfully included with this model, the RGB output, so no need for a mod to get a better picture.
No, there's no need for a mod, Neil, but we will be modifying the circuit ever so slightly to make sure that the output from the socket is SCART compliant, because it didn't quite make the grade. So the voltage it puts out isn't quite right to keep your TV locked onto that signal.
Okay, so that's the status of things here. Take us through the repair. Where did you start? What did you do first?
So the first thing I did, well, as you can see, the board is really grimy, but because you can see that somebody's been working on it, I didn't want to do anything too rough to the board, so I just dusted it off. And once I dusted it off, I felt a bit more confident then that I could work on the board.
So just a dry brush down, or did you use some IPA to help with the cleaning process?
Just a dry brush down to begin with. Then I used some IPA specifically on the areas that I was going to work on.
Right.
Because what I wanted to do was make sure I could get the board operational without putting it under too much stress. And then once I know it's working, I can come back and clean it a little bit better. After we've done that, the first thing I wanted to do is get rid of this modulator because it's really quite unpleasant, isn't it?
You're never going to use it.
No, and just the state of it as well. So that's gone. And then moved on to a full recap. And none of your in-house brand caps here, Neil. No, it's fully Panasonic from start to finish.
Sir Clive would never have splashed out on such extravagance.
He really wouldn't have.
I find with a lot of these mid-80s 8-bit micros, the caps aren't actually that bad. With the Amstrad CPCs, they seem to be real troopers. They just keep going and going. Is that the case with these?
Yeah, pretty much. Caps get a pretty bad name, and you'll hear a common misconception everywhere that changing the caps can fix all kinds of faults. Well, that's not the case, as we know, because we come across it all the time. But often, when you've got something that's a vintage of maybe 25, 30, 35 years old, the electrolytic capacitors are going to be worn, and they're definitely past their service life. But in these machines, half the caps were borderline, so they were just within serviceable, and half of the caps, the larger ones, were actually fine. Actually perfectly fine, and would have probably been fine for another 10 years, who knows.
Yeah, they may well have been, but in a situation where we're having guests here to the exhibition, we're going to be entertaining people here, and we want them to have the best experience they possibly can.
Yeah.
The last thing I want is these things switching off mid-open day, you know.
Or start having untraceable faults. And
Exactly.
embarrassment having to take them back. Oh, maybe we've got another one.
Yeah, so unless we're in a situation where we're going to make things worse, just get it done.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the cost of the capacitors and the time, you're in there anyway, you might as well get it done. But like I say, half of them were borderline anyway. So with some extended use, which we really hope they're going to get in the exhibition area, they might well have failed sooner rather than later.
And as you know, Mark, but I haven't shown this on video yet, I have sneaked out a sneaky tweet on Twitter. I've been collecting monitors because we need TVs for the exhibition area, all SCART compatible. So tell us about the SCART mod, because I want to know that I'm going to get the best picture out of this on my new televisions.
You know this is an unhealthy obsession.
I know.
Okay.
I've got 6 of the same television now.
6.
It's not healthy.
It's not. It's like some mad mastermind when you walk in, you're surrounded by all these screens. So what the SCART mod does is it makes the output from the port compatible with more televisions. So for example, this machine will work fine on my Samsung flat screen TV at home, but if you pop it into a Toshiba, you'll get a ghosted image, almost black and white, not quite locking on. And that's because the voltage is slightly wrong. And what we're going to do is we're going to change this LK4 link and we're going to move it into the LK2 position. It's as simple as that. We're just moving this piece of wire over to LK2. So all we're doing, we're swapping the link over. And here's the magic part of the formula. We're going to change this 1 kilo ohm resistor to a 680 ohm resistor. Even on my Samsung TV, I had a slight bit of ghosting, but this clears it up almost totally, this modification.
Excellent. So now we're improving on the original spec. We've got a better picture than even when it came out of the factory, but there's still that power socket at the back that I'm worried about. Do we move on to that next?
Yeah, so I thought we'd actually do it the professional way. So I've got some blue tack, some chewing gum. No, I've just got another socket, 69p off of eBay, no problem at all. £1 postage and packing, however, but it arrived in good time and we've just whipped the old one out, cleaned up the area that we're going to solder into and popped the new socket in. Now, because this is going to be under quite a lot of physical stress, we're going to make sure we give it lots of solder.
Yeah, really anchor that down to the board.
Yeah.
Yep, that's really anchored in good and proper. Now, there's really nothing we can do about that great big screw hole that's above it, is there? I mean, it's going to have to wear that as a battle scar. It's part of the history of the machine. Nobody's really going to see it unless they look around specifically at the power port, but what can we do? I don't think there's any point in making an attempt to repair that.
Well, we could use filler, try and fill it in, but then again, we've got that big hole around the front of the case as well. So I think at this point, we probably don't want to use filler and stuff like that and just, you know, take it for what it is, a machine that's seen quite a lot of active gaming play.
Yeah, it's all part of the history of the machine. And just to the side of that, I can see that the edge connector's not looking too tidy.
I'm surprised you can see the edge connector underneath all of the earth and grit and grime. And yeah, so we cleaned that up. We've used some Brasso, which is, I know, one of your favourite substances.
It is IPA first.
No, there's no point.
Straight in with the Brasso.
Yeah, IPA doesn't actually work very well with dirt. It's really quite good with oils and films, but when you've got dirt that you need to carry away, you really need something which is either water-based or has some kind of cutting agent within it. So we're using Brasso first. Doesn't quite make the grade for me, so I then went over the fingers ever so lightly with a fiberglass pencil. And then a bit more Brasso, and then after that, some IPA.
Nice. And it's important that we get this nice and clean and working because all of the modern upgrades that we might use on this, as we'll see later, are dependent on that edge connector.
Yeah, absolutely. And if any of the edge connector fingers aren't electrically functional, then a lot of the modern upgrades, for example, the Div MMCs or the Dandanator Mini, they just won't function. So I need to make sure that all of those fingers are really, really clean.
Now, we will be using modern SD card solutions with this, but it's always nice once in a while to enjoy the experience, if enjoy is the right word, relive the experience of taking a cassette tape, putting it in, waiting and sipping your tea while you watch it load. So we do want the cassette deck to be working, don't we?
We do, and for me, sometimes loading the game is the best part of the nostalgia experience, because when I get into the game, I realise how terrible I am at games. No, you're absolutely right, and we can see that this Spectrum hasn't been stored very well in the past, so immediately when we move over to the tape cassette board, we can suspect at least half the capacitors, so we're going to change those. Change the capacitors on this board is quite an easy task, but the most difficult part is actually removing the board, because underneath there's kind of a rat's nest of wires. So just getting it off isn't enough, so I've had to undo this LED board. And as you can see, it's quite mucky, so I thought I'd leave that for you, Neil. Is that okay?
Thank you, Mark. Very kind of you.
Yeah.
And there are those caps going in. They look great, those new Panasonic caps. You're a recapping machine, Mark. And when it comes to tape decks like this, Perished belts are normally the first thing that comes to mind. If they haven't already perished, you're going to want to replace them, aren't you?
Yeah, you find in this model they tend to go slack before they break or perish. So
Or some of the worst ones just go gummy, don't they?
they turn into like a black tar.
Yeah.
But these ones aren't too bad. In some ways that's worse because it leads you to believe that they're working. So you'll see that the deck can fast forward and rewind, but when you press play, the mechanical load on the motor, it just can't move. So we're going to need to change these belts. And on this model, there's actually two belts. So we've got the larger one, which as you can see, comes off really easily.
That smaller one looks a lot harder to pull off, Mark.
Yeah, I find the smaller they are, the harder they are to get hold of. Plus, underneath the larger wheel, there's a small piece of the pause latching mechanism. It's a small white piece of plastic and it's quite close to the wheel. So you have to make sure that you get the belt over the top of that, otherwise you can't get the belt off. But when you do finally manage to pull it off, it's really satisfying.
I could see on your face when you managed that. It looked good.
So with both the belts off, it's simply a matter of reversing the process. I take the smaller belt and I slip it under the larger wheel, over the top of that latching mechanism, and then I put it over the smaller wheel and rotate it a few times to make sure that the belt isn't kinky. And with that belt on, it's simply a matter of just popping the second one on, and that's dead easy. It's totally accessible. And with that, the belt change is done.
Yeah, everything looks to be moving correctly. So we've got a good power socket, we've got a good edge connector, you've cleaned down the board, we've got the tape deck, looks like it should be in good working order. We'll test that out shortly.
Modulator's gone.
The RGB mod's done for our SCART socket on our television. All seems good, but it's still one hell of a mucky unit, and I think I need to put on my murder gloves and give this a good clean, Mark.
I think you need to give it a good going over.
So here's the machine now over on my desk. We've stripped it down, ready for a deep clean. We have to take the keyboard out, and there's just a few screws to release that. Of course, we took out the system board and the tape deck, put that to one side, so we're not going to get that wet. But we will come back to the tape deck because that is still quite a lot dirtier than the system board that you've brushed down. So need to give that a bit of a clean.
Yeah, particularly the heads.
So the keyboards come out, and now I want to take the keycaps off and give them all an individual clean to get that horrible speckly mould off of there.
Yeah, why don't you use your keycap puller?
Well, you know why, Mark, because in the move to this new cave, somehow my keycap puller has gone walkabout. I'm going to have to get a new one, all 50p of it, or however much these things cost.
It's the ghost. It's the ghost is hiding things, the ghost of the mill.
So I've had to improvise with a spudger here to pop out the keys.
It's a respectable method.
Now, when you take the keys off of here, there are two springs. There's one large spring, and then there's one small spring within the key, and those small springs do come out, and you may want to consider taking them out for cleaning. But actually, they're in there quite firmly, and I'm more worried about stretching the spring when I pull them out. So I'm happier to just leave them in there. Of course, the key is to make sure that they're as dry as possible so that those springs don't start rusting if you've left a little bit of water in
So
there.
are they just held in with a friction fit?
Yeah, they're just pushed around a post. There's a tighter coil at the end of the spring that's around the post. And my fear is just stretching them out too much and ruining the action of the key on the keyboard. You want them all to feel the same.
You don't want anything stretched out too much.
But thankfully, all of the keycaps came off. The plastics weren't brittle, nothing snapped. You know, it was all in good order, and all of these keys are reusable again. So that's fantastic. Then it was time to go and get a big old tub of warm water and car shampoo in here.
Is it bath time, Neil?
As much as you need one, Mark, it is for our ZX Spectrum, but not for you.
You're calling me smelly?
And boy, does this Spectrum need this big bubbly bath. We're getting in there, into the tub, it all goes. The case, first of all. There's no substitute, Mark, for good old elbow grease, a soft brush to get into all the grooves, and there are quite a few grooves on this case.
Yeah, I was thinking there was no substitute for elbow grease as I sat watching you clean it.
Yeah, I wish there was. I wish we could just get out a microcomputer pressure washer and hose these things down, but there's no alternative. Perhaps an ultrasonic cleaner might be an alternative if we could get hold of one that's large enough for a micro like this, but I don't think they're particularly cheap, so this is our method for now. I did use a little bit of WD-40 on some sticker residue on the case, on the top of the case, just before I put it in.
Was that definitely sticker residue then?
I'm not sure, but whatever it was, the WD-40 did help to get it shifted.
Okay, well that's
and
good
then
news.
the soap suds did the rest. So WD-40 is a great tip. And then the keys went in, and I'm pleased to say that the mould came straight off. Those speckles of mould came off nicely.
Oh, that's excellent news, because sometimes when you get those little black spots of mould, you wash them off and you can see there's damage underneath. Sometimes it whitens the plastic or eats into the plastic. It's amazing when you think a mould can eat plastic, isn't it?
Yeah, well, give it 20 or 30 years and it can do that. You know, it can really cause some discoloration, but thankfully none of that. The only tiny bit of discoloration I can detect on this is a tiny tinge of green on some of the edges, and that's just like the beige and white computers turning yellow. It's the same process.
Yeah, I suppose that the grey has got an element of blue in it, and then the yellowing of the plastic actually adds to that and makes it green.
Yeah, so maybe one day when we've got a beaten up case for another ZX Spectrum, perhaps we could try some retro brighting and see how that works with black plastics.
True.
Or I do have an SGI Indy, which is a beautiful blue colour, but it's turning yellow.
Oh, wow.
I wonder if that can be retro brighted. Anyway, thoughts for another video. Back to the cleaning here. I'm scrubbing all of the keys one by one. It's a patient person's job. You've just got to work through every single key, put them to one side, and you've got to make sure, you have to make sure they're completely dry before they go anywhere near the computer again.
Oh, does that mean we can have a couple of hours off then, Neil?
Nope, no tea break for you, Mark, because I've got a tip here. It's my Compu Cleaner Professional, which gives a blast of high pressure air. I use it for cleaning all sorts, cleaning computers, cleaning down the desk before filming. It's a really useful tool.
Does it work for drying your hair?
I wouldn't know, but maybe we can test that out with you. Stick your head in here, Mark. No, but if you get this nice and close to the keys, you can really blast out any watery residue that's left in there. Make sure that spring's really dry, and we can be confident that these are safe to go on the computer again.
Excellent.
And if you look closely, you'll probably see some of that water spraying out as I blow hot air into the keys here. A few other finishing touches to make sure this is in tip-top condition. You've got the clear acrylic window on the tape deck there, or the data corder as it's called on the ZX Spectrum. And there are a few surface scratches on there. It's not in terrible condition. I've seen a lot worse.
Definitely.
And a little tip we talked about in the Atari 2600 video was using Brasso to take off surface scratches. And do you know what? I think it came up quite well. I did both sides. It was still a little bit damp, and the tips that I read were you want the Brasso, you want to make a kind of slightly wet surface with the Brasso, rub it all over in a circular motion, and then you want to buff it off with a microfiber cloth.
And how did that go?
Well, I think the result afterwards was pretty good. There were still some marks on there, but I think it was a hell of a lot better than when we started. So I think that's a top tip. You don't want to overdo it, and it's not going to get into any deep scratches, but it did help a little bit, I think.
Okay, well, any improvements again?
Finally, I moved over to the data corder, which I just needed to clean out with an anti-static brush to get rid of any debris, gave it a blast with the air compressor, and then most importantly, cleaned the heads. That's just some IPA on the end of a cotton bud. I don't think we need any more than that. It does a good job of cleaning it up, and it looked squeaky clean. I also used it to clean up the LED board, which you kindly left me covered in muck, and it came off very easily. And after all of that, I was happy that this was going to look great when we put it back together. So I carefully put it all back together, making sure to connect the data corder as you put the two halves of the case back together, the top and the bottom half, and very carefully making sure that the keyboard membrane is plugged in. That's the last thing that you plug in before you tighten the screws.
And if you wiggle slightly out of range, those keyboard membrane tails pop out again. So
it's a real pain. It took me a few attempts, but we got it in there, got all the screws in. As I turned it over to put the screws in, I noticed that we're actually missing 3 of the 4 feet on the bottom of there.
Yes.
And as luck would have it, I had some spares. So we've got some original rubber feet from a ZX Spectrum back on there, and its undercarriage is as good as new. And now, Mark, I like nothing better than to show off our restored computers in situ, doing its thing. So let's just enjoy having a look at this machine in action, all cleaned up. So you moved on to using some modern alternatives to load games, which you had in the back of the machine. put that edge connector to the test. Worked out fine, didn't it?
Worked great. First off, we used a Dandinator Mini and we played a couple of games.
And that also includes some self-tests, doesn't it? So we can be really confident that this machine's fixed and working 100%. I love the look of this thing, Mark. It looks great to see it in action. So many great Spectrum memories, so many great Spectrum games. Memories for me of going around to a friend's house because I didn't have a Spectrum, but it was always a treat to go and see what games they had. And the very unique style of the ZX Spectrum with its charming colour clash. I'm not sure Commodore 64 owners would see it as charming. They would see it as a...
Colourful?
Colourful. They would see it as a
Not brown.
drawback, as a negative. But I like it. I think it's aged in a very charming way, the ZX Spectrum.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a cheap machine built to a cheap price point for a certain demographic. And I think for what it was, it's changed the world in ways that possibly we can't even imagine.
It's very easy to look down your nose at the ZX Spectrum, but if you think about other parts of the world, like say the US, did they have an equivalent machine at such a low price point that could do things like the ZX Spectrum? So I hope you've enjoyed our restoration today, and I hope many of you will get to come and enjoy it in person at some point. We've got so many other ZX Spectrums as well here. The Plus 3 I'd really like to get checked over and working at some point. It's pretty much the same machine, it's just got a disk drive in there, hasn't it? It's what the 6128 is to the 464 in the Amstrad range.
There's quite a considerable amount of changes from this grey Plus 2 model up to this black.
You know your Spectrums,
Plus
don't
3.
you? You really do.
But that's something that we can explore when we get our hands on this one.
Right, I'll look forward to that. I look forward to that. But for today, our humble Plus 2, I'm really pleased with the restoration. It's come up beautifully. As always, thank you to everyone for watching. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.